Fink's last principle of visual imagery has to do with the ways images are organized and assembled coherently, you might say. The structure of mental images corresponds to that of perceived objects. So there's a way to describe this most succinctly in a very clever experiment that's described 2 slides from now, if you'll indulge me. But imagine that you need to draw a picture of an object and that you need to look carefully at an object. So how would you do this, and what properties of the object would influence the difficulty of the task of actually drawing it? And I'm not a good artist. Generally speaking, the larger the object, the more time it would take to look over or draw. We would grant that. Also, the more complicated it is, the harder it would be to draw after you've looked over it carefully. So these authors, starting with Coslin, studied image generation as it relates to the complexity of the object to be imagined. Participants were asked to form images of pictures that differed in the amount of details, such as those in 9.12a, and here's 9.12. So you see there a crocodile, and in B you see what could be 2 rectangles overlaying each other. It took participants about 1.3 times as long to form an image of the detailed picture as it did other participants to form images of the outline drawings. So you've got a detailed picture and an outline drawing. Okay, well, fair enough. In a related study, the authors used geometric forms such as those shown in 9.12b, which is, to me, the more important part of the experiment. For instance, the image in B could be described as 5 squares in the shape of a cross or 2 overlapping rectangles. I'm going to blow that up to really demonstrate that. You can see in B that could be 2 overlapping rectangles or 5 squares in the shape of a cross, however you describe it. Participants first read a description and then saw the corresponding figure and then covered it up and formed a visual image of the figure. The authors found that people given the first description took longer to form the image than people given the second description, which was just the overlapping rectangles, which is easy to interpret, even though the physical stimulus was exactly the same. Now you'll notice, by the way, it would be faster to draw if you conceived of it as 2 rectangles rather than the 5 squares. It'd be easy to do that. So with images, apparently, the greater the complexity of the conceived structure, the longer it takes to assemble it. So the alligator has its potential to be described, but I'm really more focused on B. That if I describe this as 5 squares comprising a cross, and then let you look at it for a second before you draw it, that takes a little bit longer to do. That's just more involved mentally. But if you just think of it as 2 overlaying rectangles, then it's fairly easy to do. And the suggestion is that the structural equivalence of those 2 things comes into play. Basically, the verbal description of it, and I like the way that your author describes this, that the very bottom sentence there, Coslin et al. Found that people given the first description took longer to form the image, the 5 squares in the form of a cross, than the second description, which was the 2 overlaying rectangles. So in that case, as we see here, the way that you conceived of it, well, excuse me, good grief. Let me try to reduce that a little bit. Thanks for waiting. If you conceived of it as 2 rectangles rather than the 5 squares, with images, apparently, the greater the complexity of the conceived structure, the longer it takes to assemble an image and for people to draw it, although they're understood not to be very good artists. So here's that top sentence again. It states that the structure of mental images corresponds to that of actual perceived objects in the sense that the structure is coherent, well organized, and can be reorganized and reinterpreted. If I have to organize something mentally that's a little bit more complicated, such as 5 squares forming a cross, in that case, the interpretation is longer and the physical manifestation takes longer. So that's this idea of structural equivalence. A very clever experiment, and I think the rectangles actually demonstrate that more powerfully than the crocodile or the similar stimulus.